We are proud to host today a couple of our presenters. Our panelists are Kristen Hamilton and Bryan Johanson. Kristen is the COO of Koru. She is a self-proclaimed technology entrepreneur and education innovation junkie. And in the first half of her career, she co-founded the e-commerce business Onvia and acted as the COO of World Learning. Bryan is the COO of the Adler Group, and he's been consulting and training for the last 12 years with companies like Bank of New York Mellon, Royal Canadian Bank Wells Fargo, Arby's, Panda, REI, and YMCA. And prior to joining the Adler Group, he held positions as VP of Power Hiring, VP of Sales for Enfish, and a Senior Director at Novell. Our moderator today is Trudy Steinfeld. Trudy is an early careers and workplace expert, and most recently has been the Associate Vice President of the NYU Wasserman Center for Career Development. She is a thought leader in career development and college talent, and she is a consultant, coach, and trainer. And Trudy is a frequent contributor to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, New York Daily News, New York Post, NBC, CBS, CNN, and she writes the Career Warrior column for Forbes.com. We are thrilled to have all three of you with us. And without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand the call over to Trudy to get us started. Trudy, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks so much, JJ, and thanks to everybody who's joining us. I'm delighted to be the moderator for this really experienced panel. And so without further ado, let's get into it. Bryan and Kristen, I know that our audience can also relate to this because they spend a lot of time thinking about fit. Can you think of a job you or someone you know had that was a bad fit from the beginning, and how our audience can avoid these type of mistakes in the future?
Kristen, do you want to go?
Sure. Hi, everybody, and thanks for the good question and the introduction, JJ. Well, it's a good question. I think the one I feel most strongly about not being a fit was probably mucking out stalls at the barn, but but actually that was part of my probably appropriate experience to learn how to work hard. But I like to tell the story to other early career talent, people looking for jobs, about being hired as an analyst at a massive oil and gas company. And I was recruited on campus, and I sort of felt like I did all the right things and got this job before even graduating, and it seemed all well and good. But actually, the week I started, I realized I'd made a massive mistake. And I think it was just the wrong fit for me in many ways. I think your question about avoiding mistakes, I guess I would say, I think it happens a lot. And I would say that to avoid the mistakes, really having two-sided awareness about about fit, right? What's the right fit on the side of the applicant? What's the right fit on the side of the company? Of course, we're going to talk a bit more about that today.
Okay. Bryan?
Yeah, for me, it was after about 9 years in a career in high-tech sales and marketing, and the company was actually merged with another company. And it didn't take but probably 3-4 weeks for me to realize the entire landscape had changed, the way things happen, who had authority and power, even the nature of the work I was doing literally changed overnight. And over the course of the next 6 months, it became very apparent to me that it wasn't the work I wanted, it wasn't the environment I wanted, and I eventually left that environment. And how to avoid that, I think there are two things. One, you have to be very clear about what you want to do. And you have to be willing to be objective about that as you go into any work environment, and make sure that what you're doing is something that's challenging, will help you learn and grow. So that's my experience.
Okay. So obviously the hiring game has changed, and I can tell you from my experience, particularly working in the early career space with so many talent leaders, that they're overwhelmed, as I'm sure some of the folks listening in today feel, getting so many applicants. Their ATS systems are overwhelmed. So Kristen, you know, employers that are looking at new college talent, I think they get an average of at least 250 applications for each listing, yet over 50%, I think it's 53%, say they don't have enough qualified applicants. So why is this occurring, and how, you know, what can we do to change this? And also, what are some of the common pain points that most of the hiring managers that you're working with really talk about and really cite?
Yeah. Well, I think they're really going to talk about three things in terms of the reasoning and behind why the hiring game has changed, but also, what it means for hiring managers, of course. So the first thing I would say is that we are in what they call the innovation economy, and that changed a lot. Essentially, it means that the jobs that people are doing today are different than not only have they not been done before, but they're fundamentally different than jobs that were done 20 years ago. And so in many ways, that means that the innovation required of companies these days to compete is not possible without pretty significant culture change. And of course, culture is all about people. And so really, if you think about what drives the engine, the economic engine of a business, it is, of course, the people, especially increasingly, we're in a services economy, a lot is being done by machines as if it's possible. And so what's left is higher order thinking, and it's all about people. It's increasingly, actually. And so, I think the important thing is the drivers of the business, of course, are the same drivers of what, someone's recruiting strategy should help them do. It's really driving performance, retention, diversity, and efficiency. And so that's the first thing, is I think just the advent of the innovation economy. The second thing that I would love to point out, and this slide does a really good job of describing it, is that the advent of digital sourcing. So for those on the phone who are talent acquisition professionals, I know you've experienced being able to source applicants from a variety of sources that are digital, of course. And what we hear consistently is, boy, we have nothing but applicants. We get lots and lots of applicants. That is not our problem. So the advent of one-click apply has meant that the ratio between applicants and accepts and ultimately hires has really changed. We know some companies, for example, to do 800 hires, one of our customers has had 250,000 applicants. So the ratios are crazy. So that's the other thing that's really changed as well in terms of setting up what's new in the environment today. We like to say it's 10 times harder to get a job at a top company than to get into an Ivy League school, which is just insane in terms of the numbers. So you think about that from both the applicant and the employer side, it's very challenging. And then finally, the other piece I would say is that what we're doing in hiring in a way traditionally is, we like to say it's a little bit akin to insanity, in the sense that we're repeating the same behaviors and expecting a different result sometimes. Because I think a lot of people recognize that things like where you went to college or what your grade point average was or your grades is not a good predictor of workplace performance. And that's actually been proven out in the research. So we see this quote from Laszlo Bock at Google. When they did their research, they found the same thing. So the other big piece is, how do we measure these, what is called here, soft skills? If we think those are the big drivers of performance in the innovation economy, increasingly things like teamwork and grit, et cetera, then how do we measure those things, and how can we use those as resume screens instead of doing things like where'd you go to college and what was your GPA?
Great. So Bryan, just, the assumption has always been, and you saw some on that slide about some of the funnels, that the best way to hire is you write the job description, you identify and recruit candidates that fit that job description, but it's being challenged. Can you give us a little guidance about how things have changed and how this impacts performance?
Well, I think there are several things that have changed and several things that haven't changed about the process, not the least of which happens to be that the process is still very much a biased process. If you look at sort of the user interface of a candidate, and I think we're on that slide which talks about the impact of the hiring process versus performance.
Right.
That has a huge impact, because if somebody looks good and sounds good and looks good on paper and has all the signals that actually aren't the right signals, as Kristen just mentioned them, we're likely to hire them, as long as the basics are in place. And if they're competent and capable, that's great. That's a lucky hire. But if they're less competent and less capable, but they look good, we're still likely to hire them. so if you look at the mistakes that are made, the biggest mistakes we make are not hiring somebody who's really good, whose user interface isn't quite as good, meaning they're not as good of an interviewer, or they didn't write their resume quite the same way, or we have to fish a little bit more deeply to figure out what they actually have done, versus somebody who has all of those capabilities and attributes. So that's the first thing, and that impacts performance. The second thing I would say is our filter with performance-based hiring, which is this next slide. What do tier 1 people do differently? This is fairly universal, and it maps very closely to the idea at Koru, which is look at what top performers do, but filter that through the actual job, and we'll come to that in a minute. And if you can find out what top performers do, then you can utilize the time that you're going to invest in hiring to understand that. And that's what what do top people do differently. Everybody on this phone, if they were to sit back and just make a quick list of somebody they know that they thought was outstanding, that they worked with for at least a year or 6 months, you would get some of the attributes listed on the screen. And so we think about that as the lens through which all the process of hiring should be performed, if you will. So that's my take on that.
So there are new signals of performance, and there's been so much focus on job readiness now in the innovation economy. And Kristen, can you tell us a little about the focus on the impact skills that Koru has developed provides a new and really more effective way to hire this early talent? And then I'm going to ask Bryan and both of you maybe to comment a little bit about Bryan's comment about bias in hiring, the way people look, which school they're from as well.
Yeah, sure. So we were talking about pain points previously, and I think one of the pain points that we hear a lot from hiring managers, from talent acquisition professionals is, okay, how do I choose from that big top of funnel? How do I know who's a good fit? And so what we see here in this slide is specifically what are the predictors of performance. And there has been an evolution of research over the past few decades about what people believe to be drivers or predictors of performance. So for example, we used to think personality was an important driver of performance, and we did a lot of personality assessments. And there was a large focus on cognitive capabilities. And so the latest and greatest research says that there are really 3 buckets of things that drive performance in the workplace. The first is raw intelligence. So certainly IQ matters to a point, although there's data suggests that extra points of IQ don't actually get you extra points of workplace performance. The other is technical skills to do the job. Clearly, if you're going to be a software developer, you need to know how to code, etc. If you're going to be a welder, you need to know how to weld. And then finally is this other group of impact skills. So we were talking about, gosh, if it's not, GPA and college rank, what could it be? And this has been sort of the undiscovered group, this impact skills section. That's this sort of a code word for soft skills, right? So on this slide is a definition of these seven soft skills. We call them impact skills, which are very much research-based, importantly. So we didn't just put 7 words on a slide here. It was really interesting to see what Bryan had said about those things that tend to be, always true in high performers. When you look at it qualitatively, they're very much present in these 7 competencies. And there's been research for decades about, how to measure teamwork, for example, and its outcomes in the workplace. So there are 16 sub-competencies here, but I'll quickly just go over these ones. And I think people intuitively believe that, yeah, teamwork and grit and polish and rigor drive performance. But now we can measure these things, which is really incredibly helpful. So grit is just tenacity, perseverance in the face of ambiguity. And there are so many ambiguous environments in the innovation economy that's very important. Curiosity is sort of the birthplace of creativity. So to be a creative, customer empathetic learner, if you will. And then teamwork is about recognizing emotions in others and actually drawing forth the best of the group. So it's not about, did you play, a sport for a long time in school. And then impact is about knowing what the goals are in an organization and just prioritizing your time to achieve those, so being a systems thinker. Polish is effective communication in the business environment and having high EQ. Rigor is using data to tell stories and actually to really make recommendations, not just data for data's sake. And then finally, the last one here is ownership, which is really a mindset, which is when things go poorly as they're wont to do in any business environment or work environment, things don't go as planned. The people who are high in ownership don't blame and complain. They're the ones that sort of take the reins and say, how do we move forward? And they inspire others to do the same. So those are the 7 competencies that we have been able to measure. And as you can see in this pie chart, specifically, the pieces that we've put together to be able to look at what drives performance in a job and then also in an individual is first those impact skills, but that's not the whole puzzle, obviously. We also look at background in terms of work experience, broadly speaking, and also academic experience. And actually, there are hundreds of data points that come from these various areas. And then we realize that each company is actually unique. So these are the predictors of performance, but it really very much depends specifically on the job in the company to get really specific around what drives performance in a given job. With these new skills, measurement of these skills, I should say, it really helps to be able to use the data to actually try to get at that notion of fit, which we started talking about at the beginning.
Yeah. Bryan, did you, I think you had an example that's coming up on the next slide in some of the ways that you were able to apply these Koru 7 to an organization you were working with. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that? I don't think we can hear you.
Absolutely, thank you.
Oh, sure.
I'm here. This is an example, a real client that we worked on together. They were very interested in the Koru 7, and they were very interested in how to make their interviewing mirror what they were learning through the attributes and factors that were assessed in the Koru 7, and what were most important. So the challenge with this, and this was for entry-level accountants right out of school, people who had graduated with their accounting degree, they're taking their first job, and they went through the process of assessing the candidates to really weed out and weed in those that would be the best fits for them. And then they had to interview them. And so our job was to say and ask the question, how do we mirror the interview process to that? And in performance-based hiring, our methodology is to really dig into the job itself. And Kristen said this, which is, it is job specific. To go through and measure these things, you have to measure it against the job. And we take that even to another level, which is, if somebody has grit, do they have grit universally, or do they have grit in certain things, or curiosity in certain things? And what does great polish look like in relationship to a specific job? So we defined performance objectives relevant to the Koru 7, and then designed interview questions to help the senior accountants actually conduct interviews on campus and then in person to validate and to amplify what was actually learned through the Koru 7. So this is an example of what those things are, and I'll just highlight one so that you get a sense for what this looks like. Curiosity, and this was interesting to me as we interviewed first-year candidates who were top performers. It's not enough just to be curious. It was interesting, they actually had to not only be curious and learn, but they also had to be able to apply the learning. That became a differentiator. So in the interviews, we created questions designed to really pull those things out in the interview so that they could actually go deeper and see how they were applying knowledge rather than just gaining knowledge. And GPA is not really the best indicator of gaining knowledge. And curiosity is in classes, if you get straight A's, that doesn't mean you're curious. That means you want to be a good student. And so curiosity is a bit different than that. And so what we try to do is use the interview to enhance that. So if you go to the next slide, how does performance-based hiring offer a more effective pathway? What it allows you to do is really focus in on key things. And there's a hiring formula for success that we use. Ability, and this matches very closely to what Kristen was just saying, ability, technical, team, organizational, problem solving. Fit, which is critical. You know, every interview is a two-way interview, and people have to decide, do I want to be in this culture, this environment? And most people, even especially early career, they leave because the job isn't challenging, or they leave because there's some conflict with the manager. And culture is a part of that. And then motivation. And motivation is squared because it is general in the sense that all of us had jobs when we were in college. We worked hard at them. We needed the money. We paid for school with them. But when we graduate, we're not motivated to be a waitress or a clerk or a TA or those jobs. Those are not jobs that are motivating us going forward. So we have to have that motivational match. And then all of that will equal performance. So that's kind of how we view these types of things as we go forward. Now go to the next slide. We'll talk briefly about this. Interviews, and especially, I like the way they call them in India, fresher interviews, people right out of college, early career people. They tend not to be very accurate. And they tend not to be accurate for the reasons I just stated. We're not tying it back to what actually has to happen in the job. And we're not asking questions at a good enough level to understand what's really going on. So our goal is to take that interview and make it much more effective. 57%, by the way, is 7% better than flipping a coin. So if you're frustrated with your hiring process and you want to get it over with quick, and you're interviewing at 57%, you might as well flip the coin. Heads, they win. Tails, they don't get the job. It'll be almost as accurate as what many people are doing in an interview. It doesn't have to be that way, but statistically, with lots of the studies out there, all the way from CEOs down, it is that way. So our goal is to take the variables out of that. First impressions is huge, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The job, if you don't know the job and you don't really understand what performance looks like, you're going to make hiring mistakes. And so those are the things that drive this. So let me give you kind of the approach. The first 4 steps in this are actually what I would do on a college interview. Certainly you want to understand their motivation. And that is not a given. And that's interesting to me. People go to college, they have a course of study. 70% of them aren't going to work in what they study. So the course of study isn't a very good predictor of whether they want to do that. And that's less true with technical degrees or accounting degrees. But there are people who make it through that 4-year accounting program, do it for a year, and say, you know what, this is just not for me. So understanding where they're at and why they're doing, what their motivation. Controlling emotions, which we'll come back to. We're going to talk about how to use the work history specifically to get at what we call an achiever pattern. Single biggest predictor of whether somebody's going to be a great employee is, do they have some sort of achiever pattern? And it's hard to find in some cases. And then we'll talk about how do you get at accomplishments, what they've actually done, where they've spent time, where they've gone above and beyond. So that's the core, especially in those 30-minute campus interviews with people right out of college that we call the 2-question interview. So that's kind of the approach.
Yeah. Before we get to the next question, I just want to say from my experience, having dealt with literally thousands of early talent campus recruiting organizations, usually the first 2 things that I had been asked is, okay, give us everybody with a 3.7, 3.9 GPA, and of course, I want your engineers, accountants, few other specific academic majors, and everybody else will kind of discard. And I think what you're describing really is great news for students in academic majors across the landscape. I think it does a lot to level the playing field. And I think, again, it really will help with hiring that is better for the fit and the types of things that organizations are really looking for achievement. And by the way, as I'm sure everyone knows, we have a big problem with retention, especially in early careers. And that's a way to get at that. And that's going to save the company the bottom line as well. But Kristen, I wanted to talk a little bit with you about predictive hiring. Can you really provide an explanation and tell the audience, a little bit about the new practice of predictive hiring and what that really looks like for organizations hiring, particularly early and diverse talent?
Sure. Before we get into that, I really just want to share that I appreciate very much that you brought up leveling the playing field. I mean, it's very relevant to this question, actually. Just it's a great point, because we're thinking about how can we help employers hire better, therefore be higher performing as companies and so forth. But it's also important to realize that this is an ecosystem, and the current ways in which applicants are screened at the top of funnel, if things like GPA or college rank are used, quite biased, actually. And so we've looked at that data to try and understand how can we make sure, as we're beginning to assess these other skills, that we do not introduce more bias. And so that's a legal requirement of these tools, first of all, which is good news. But the point being, if we want to give people access to opportunity based on what they can do, then this is really the outcome of this particular work that we're doing. I think both Bryan's work and our work at Koru is really actually has that as a pretty exciting outcome. So let's dive in. What does predictive hiring look like? Well, I'd love to use this example from the real world, which is, it used to be that when you wanted to watch a movie, you would drive down to your local video store, and you would browse the aisles, and there was no particular, maybe they had them organized in sections, but it was not personalized for you by any means. You would browse, look, think, maybe just grab a movie, but you weren't really being aided in terms of what might be a right fit for you. Fast forward into the world of Netflix, and you have your feed. Your feed knows you because it's tracking what you watched before, what you've searched on, what you've been purchasing on Netflix. And so suddenly you have this feed of things that are likely to be a good fit for you. And I like to use that analogy because we see this actual pattern in all sorts of consumer and business applications, right? So actually the idea of we're going to predict what we think you want, what is a good fit. And it's relevant because there is a shift happening now in the hiring world, in the talent world. And this is one way to describe the shift, which is from traditional hiring, which we've talked about a fair bit here, and to predictive hiring. And one of the challenges is the poor signals. The other is unstructured interviewing, which Bryan has talked about, but also there is the introduction of sometimes human bias at the wrong times. One thing that I firmly believe, and I know we do at Koru, is that we don't think machines should take over, right? It's the combination of aided by data and technology, but really human judgment, then having access to that data will make the best outcomes. So we're making the shift as an industry, as a society, I think, towards data-driven hiring, but we have lots of learning to do. So the idea is, okay, how can we create these custom predictive models specific to companies? And here is a very sort of elaborate way to answer that question. So each company is different, so we need to know first what drives performance in a role. So here's how this works. Each position in a company has unique performance drivers. And so how it works is we actually take a subset of existing employees, and we use technology and data to look for differences between the high performers and low performers. And those employees are giving us data, right? They're actually completing a structured online data completion exercise. And the machines look for differences between the high performers and the lower performers, and that's what creates this performance profile, if you will, or fingerprint. And usually there are between 6 and 16 drivers of performance for a role. Here's an example of one that would be a role that a fingerprint would tell us that to be high performing in this role, the drivers are grit, ownership, teamwork, and rigor. Those are the 4 from the Koru 7. And then having done a leadership role in extracurricular, having had a thesis or capstone, having played a college sport, having worked more than 24 hours during college per week, and having experience in the service industry and the technology industry. It doesn't mean every applicant needs to hit high on all of those things to be a good fit, but those are statistically the things that have shown up as drivers of performance in a role. And then the spider web on the right shows you, okay, you overlay an applicant, right, onto that, which is sort of the green piece. And it says, okay, each candidate is compared to that fingerprint to generate what we call a fit score. And it really is a predicted fit for that applicant in that job. So this is kind of just trying to describe what's happening in these sort of machine learning algorithms in the background with a visual for you. But that's the first thing. And then we like to say, okay, so, you know, instead of looking through resumes that all look different or online profiles or, you know, looking at the data that's come from your ATS, but that is actually sort of old world data, like not really giving you much in terms of fit, you actually have a dashboard, which is a stack ranked set of recommendations based on predictive fit. Now, back to that story of those huge numbers of applicants, this is pretty exciting if you think about, you know, very large numbers, thousands of applicants, which typically you wouldn't look at all of them. So importantly, you would say, we've got to cut this down. We can't look at all these people, so we would have some way to cut down that large top of your applicant funnel. And actually, now you can look at everybody. Everyone who is an applicant could be invited to this online interview. Once they fill that out, the applicant is given a fit score. And what it does is it helps you to sort of provide openness towards applicants that maybe don't look good on paper because they didn't do a great job with their resume, or they didn't have the right college on their resume, et cetera. But they get screened in, which is really exciting. And we've seen our employers get really excited about that. It tends to screen in diversity, actually, as well. And then it also tends to cut out those bad hires that look good on paper but don't end up being necessarily the right fit. And so you can actually understand, when you look at a data-driven profile, not only their fit score, but where did they meet the fingerprint profile, and where did they come short. So when you're doing your structured interview that Bryan's talking about, you have some data to help you to really know where to focus, because if they're way exceeding the scale on grit, but they're sort of coming short on another predictor like teamwork, boy, you better maybe focus on that teamwork piece in the interview. It really kind of helps to guide the work that Bryan's talked about so eloquently.
Right. So, Bryan, I'm sure everybody who's listening in is sometimes struggling with, boy, I really want to get at what makes this candidate really a good fit, but so many of the early candidates, depending upon the institution and some of the experiential learning opportunities they had, don't have a lot of work experience. So can you talk a little bit about how you can effectively interview candidates with limited work experience? And Kristen, I might ask you after Bryan makes his comments to really talk a little bit about how you can integrate that into the interview process as well.
Perfect. So I think there are several things that will make interviews more effective. And let me make this statement right up front. Everybody I know who's good has done stuff. And so there is evidence for anybody you interview who is good that you can utilize to make a sound hiring decision. And that starts as early as the work history review. So if you look at a typical work history review and you've got a college student or an early career, maybe they have one job, or maybe they just worked their way through college, or maybe they just had high school. The types of jobs they've had, likely not totally relevant to what you want them to do. But there are still clues in a work history review that will tell you what type of individual you've got. We call that an achiever pattern. And it's great if it's just laid out there for you. I was president of this, I was valedictorian. It's a great article about what happened to your valedictorian. Most of them actually didn't do as well as they were expected to do. So that may not be a great indicator. But I do want to just pull out things where people put in time and energy. So when we look at a work history review, we're trying to pull out what separates them in the area that they're in. And so let me give you an example. If somebody has only McDonald's, which I think is a typical job that somebody might have, fast food in high school or in college, and you're trying to figure out if they're a top performer in that environment, you have to know what the achiever pattern is there. Let me give it to you. Very simple. They have awards, Employee of the Month. If they didn't win it once in the last year, they're not in the top third. There are 34 employees in a typical McDonald's. I always ask people who are early career, does the manager ever ask you to lock up at night? Because managers won't hand keys to somebody they don't trust. Are they asked to train other people? Are they asked to do the hardest jobs in fast food, which is the drive-through line? Are they given responsibilities? Did they get any level of raise, a 50 cent or $1 bump in their salary? Does the manager work around their schedule? Those types of questions, just with that job, will separate the top 20% from the bottom 80%. And that's true with any job. If you understand the achievement pattern, you can go through a work history review and you can pretty much tell who's got capabilities, who's being recognized, and you're looking for secondary validation that this is somebody who's an achiever. Now, if you go to the validation for an achiever pattern, obtaining results. If they have an early career, they've been in one job, I'll ask, do you have a mentor? And have you mentored anybody? Because nobody mentors somebody they don't think is high potential. That's an indicator of high potential. there's any honors or awards or recognition or any of that, I want to know about those things. And then if they're being assigned to projects, these are indicators that somebody has an achiever pattern. And I will tell you right now, there's a great book out there called The Power of Introverts in an Extroverted World. Interviewing is for extroverts, and yet half the work done on this planet is done by introverts. And so you have to dig to find this stuff in an interview. It doesn't just come up. And so we look at achiever patterns very early on. We look at it on campus when we do 30-minute interviews. And then when they come in, we continue to probe on it so we understand who do we have in this stack. Now, if you go to the next slide, this kind of lays out different things we look for. Certainly, if somebody has early sales experience, we're looking for recognition, club, ranking, how they rank compared to other salespeople. They've been assigned to tough clients, consistency awards, all of that. Team is interesting. Team roles. Everybody who comes out of school has had to do a couple of internships and they worked on projects. So we look at what role did they take? Were they assigned to that role? Why were they picked? This is the leadership piece that Kristen was just talking about. And it's very, very important. Technical is a little bit different, but overall, we're looking for these signals that will tell us that we've got somebody who's very capable and somebody who is essentially has potential. Because when you hire somebody right out of college, you're really hiring for potential. You're not hiring for absolute knowledge. There's nobody who comes out of college who has all of the skills and knowledge and capability that they need to perform excellently in the job. They're going to have to learn that. So learning and that curiosity piece becomes very, very important, especially in first jobs. So the achiever pattern is a quick way to understand who somebody is. And you have to be a pretty good interviewer to pull it out and understand what in the environments they've been in, what might that look like. And that's true. Now, I'm all for, captain of the team and all those things, but some of those things don't mean what they think they mean. Sometimes they just fell into that. They didn't work for it. They weren't elected to it. They weren't. So we have a saying with performance-based hiring, it's not what you have, it's what you do with what you have that matters. It's not the degree, it's what you did with it. It's not the job, it's what you did in that job. It's not the position, it's what you did with the position. So we do deep fact-finding in order to uncover those things of candidates and look at them a bit differently. Now, let me talk about accomplishments, which is really the next slide here. We believe that there are really only two core questions in a great interview, and I'm going to give you the first one. I won't give you the second one. We don't have time to do it, but the first one has to do with stuff that people have done. If somebody has work history, I'll just ask them to identify their significant career accomplishment. That's the universal version. If they have limited work history, or I'm trying to get something very specific, I'll say, the biggest thing you'll be doing in this job is this. Can you tell me about something you've done that's like that? It doesn't have to be exactly like that, but the thing that you think is most comparable. And then with people right out of college, we found that if you say, tell me about your most significant accomplishment, 9 times out of 10 they say, I graduated from college, which is great. But it's not specific enough for you to understand what their focus is and what they're good at and why they do what they do. So we ask it a little different of college students. I say, I want you to think about something you've done while you were in college. It could be an internship, it could be a course of study, it could be an award you won, it could be something you've done. It doesn't have to be college related, but it does have to be something where you put a lot of time, energy, and effort into it, and where you feel like you really went the extra mile. That's what I want to talk to you about. Why did you do it? And we go through a series of questions. What did you actually accomplish? How long did it take? What did you learn while you were doing it? What did you learn about yourself? What did that teach you? And so we have a series of deep fact-finding questions designed to uncover at a very deep level the motivations and the accomplishments and why they did what they did. And once you understand that, now you have a comparison point to the job you want them to do, assuming you know what success looks like in that job. So that's one of the two core questions in performance-based hiring. Tell me about your most significant accomplishment, something you've done you're proud of.
I know we're going to go to the next slide, but Kristen, I said I was going to come back to you about how you can integrate some of what Bryan's talking about and the impact skills into the interview process. I did want to make a comment though, because I was thinking as Bryan was talking that I've particularly most recently done a lot of work over the last couple of years with first generation college students. And I think this, what you said really spoke to me, and I'm sure to a lot of the audience, because first generation college students who often are helping in a family business or helping take care of a family member or doing these long commutes and doing their college homework on, on the train or while they're commuting, and they often are so shy or introverted or embarrassed to really talk about some of these very intense, I would just say, jobs that don't sound very sexy. And so, Kristen, back to you on this. How do you think you can, how would you suggest that folks listening integrate into the interview process some of what Bryan's talking about to get at really that achiever pattern and those accomplishments that may not seem as status driven?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what Bryan talks about, having a structured interview, you might as well flip a coin if you don't. That's such an important foundational piece, just doing the structured interview. But specifically, as is evident, we'd like to start with data. So what I would say in terms of a recommendation of how to get started is, I would say that you should get your team around the room, and that includes your recruiters, your talent acquisition leaders, your hiring managers, and say, okay, what do we think drives performance in this particular role? So even if you don't have a data-driven fingerprint, which of course, we could help you do, or you could just try to get to some sort of consensus to say, okay, here are the things, like maybe take the Koru 7, take all those other factors that we showed in that slide and say, what do we think? And your own, what do we think drives performance? And get to some consensus, because there oftentimes are very differing opinions. We do this all the time with companies, and people are really all over the map on that. So that's number one. And then the second piece is, I really like what you said about the first generation college students, for example, because both in terms of examples like taking care of a family member, as well as other, work or even non-work related activities, it's really hard to distinguish which of those are relevant to a job. So let's take the taking care of a family member. One of the things that we do in the Koru pre-interview process to get that fit score is we actually say, okay, tell us about things like that you did. We actually say activities, could be very broad, anything you did, could be not work related, it could be related to stuff you did in extracurriculars or your family. And then we ask you, which of these skills did you acquire doing that job? So it's really looking at helping to create clarity around the transferable skills that you may be caring for a family member, but boy, in so doing, you might have built skills like being able to influence others, because you may have to, convince other people to help you care for that person. You may actually have to manage a budget. There's so many, we can't guess at what people are actually learning that are transferable skills in those jobs, but they're very real. And so it's actually taking that language and transferring it. So that's a piece of what we actually invite people to do in an online format. And then it helps them to convey what they really got in terms of the skills from those maybe less traditional types of activities. And then finally, specifically on once you've had some clarity around which of the Koru 7 you think is are most relevant to a role, I actually published an article on the first round review. If you just search first round review, Kristen Hamilton, it'll come up, and it actually lays out how to ask interview questions for the Koru 7. I'll give one example only. One of my favorites is around ownership. So ownership, as a reminder, is those people who say, okay, bad things happen, and instead of blaming and complaining and perhaps acting like a victim, you are going to be an owner and really step up and really influence people to move in a positive direction. One of the ways we do that in interviews, to interview for that, which is not that easy, is you ask someone about the worst sort of thing that was ever done to them. Something that was very unfair, and really wasn't their fault, was clearly unfair, and sort of get them talking about that experience, and then simply empathize. So simply just say, that must have been awful. How did you even carry on? I mean, that's so terrible. How unfair. That's really seems really unjust. And you'll notice that owners will tend towards, yeah, it was tough, but I ended up really taking it as a learning experience or something like that. And people who are not owners will go the other direction. And it's really kind of interesting how consistent that's been when we interview for the ownership trait.
Yeah. Thanks. Kristen, since you're got the mic, I have another question for you for our next slide. Thanks so much for that. It's really important, I think, to get at that. But, you know, can you talk a little bit about what the research and data is really revealing about, we hear so much about job readiness, about what the true indicators are of that and workplace fit, and especially how that can be so helpful in really hiring early career talent?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll dive into some data here and go through 4 slides to give specific examples. So we talked about the fact that it's important to create custom hiring profiles, but let's look at some benchmark data. So here we have data on 2 different industries. First of all, software developers, and software developers in terms of as a whole for that job across multiple companies. That's a benchmark, as we know, is therefore it's the average. It's not specific to a company. Here is what drives performance generally in software developers. I guess unsurprisingly, in a way, rigor, right? Data-driven, very much quantitative and you know, structured in the way they do things. And then the other is curiosity. So typically, you're inventing, you're creating something, and to be really creative about how you write code is a nice partnership with the rigor piece. So, and then polish, interestingly, popped as a something that's generally as well as impact, but primarily it's about curiosity and rigor. And then the next job, just as a nice comparison we want to look at, is account executives, so salespeople, all right? And here you see a different pattern. So again, this is data from account executives across lots of different companies. You can see here that the primary drivers of performance overall are more teamwork and polish and impact. So it's really interesting to look at the comparison of those 2 different jobs as a benchmark. However, if we go on, we'll then see that by company, fit profiles vary very significantly. So this is 3 different companies that took part in our benchmark study that we did for inside sales teams, both academic, AEs, both AEs and BDRs, right? So account executives and business development reps. And you can see the differences. So the teal colored ones are ones that were the same across and were in the fingerprint, the average, and then the black ones differed. So you can see that actually the difference between companies is quite significant, right? And that's important. So it's not good enough to take an off-the-shelf benchmark and say, okay, I'll use that for my hiring. It's actually, you know, culture makes a difference. So company by company, leadership and culture means that what it takes to perform in a job that, and even the product you're selling, obviously, would make it different by company. So then the next slide I want to share is some analytics once you have all this data. So the nice thing about having fit scores is it's kind of like a proxy for quality of hire before you make a hire, which is really important because quality of hire is that elusive metric that a lot of us have been trying to figure out, but it's always after hiring. So if we could have a prediction of that, that would be helpful to avoid mistakes. So here's an example of a 2x2 where from left to right, it's high fit on the right and low fit on the left. And then the offer rate of, you know, percentage of offers that were made to the people who went to specific colleges. So if you can read this, it looks like if you're in the upper right and you have high fit and you're making a lot of offers, that seems right. That's good. You want lots of offers to high fit people. But interestingly, there are a group here of colleges that this was done for a particular group that were high fit but got very low offer rates, and these were non-core colleges for them, you know, that which makes sense because people weren't looking at them, but it really identified opportunities where, you know, you could spend more time and effort and actually look more closely at these colleges. So look at college number 9, way over there on the right, 0 offers but the highest fit. Right, and there was a significant number of applicants from that college. So it really helps you to tune where you might focus. And then finally, the last one is about diversity hiring. So if you wanted to hire, for example, from a specific diversity group, like in this case, we were looking at Latino hires, I think, it could actually do the same. So similarly, high fit, low offer rate, what's going on, and you could actually do an intervention to say, it looks like this particular group is not getting a high offer rate despite being high fit, which means something's going on and there's a bias in the system somewhere. We were able to look at where in the funnel this particular group was falling off, and they did a pre-interview training to help resolve it.
Right. Bryan, Could you tell us, just in terms of the comments that Kristen just made, again, because I know that you've spoken about and written about first impressions, and could you just really, maybe I think it's on that next slide, right. Because so many people say, oh, I knew after 10 seconds or 30 seconds or right after they want to, I've seen it so many times on campus, particularly in early career hiring for both internships and full-time, that right after there's a big debrief, they don't even wait a few minutes and they already have their impressions. Could you, talk a little bit about that in predicting performance?
Absolutely, and I think this is really the secret to eliminating half of all hiring errors, because half of all hiring errors can be related back to having an emotional reaction, either positive or negative, to a candidate. And I'll just ask everybody on this phone to think for a minute. If you've been in an interview and you conducted the full interview from beginning to end, a face-to-face interview, and it was over 45 minutes, has your impression of a candidate ever changed from the beginning to the end of an interview? That's the question. Has it ever changed from the beginning to the end of the interview? If it has, the change actually represents your bias. If they started weak and they got a lot better during the interview, whatever caused you to think they were weak, that uptight, quiet, nervous, unprofessional, that was your impression. If you started the interview and you thought they were strong, relaxed, affable, articulate, all of those things you see up in the green box, those people, you were predisposed to like them, and then during the interview, something changed. The information you got said maybe they're not a top performer, maybe they're an underperformer, maybe they're not as good as they look. So first impressions, especially early in an interview, are not very predictive. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to give you the secret. It's really, really simple. In a face-to-face interview for somebody who's already been screened, wait 30 minutes to make a hiring decision. Never, ever, ever make a hiring decision in the first 30 minutes of a face-to-face interview. It cannot be done accurately. Give them the benefit of the doubt. And there are things that you can do to control that. I don't have time to talk about all of them, but I'll give you two really quickly. One is change your mindset about the interview. Interviews are not for making hiring decisions. You may have thought they were, but they're not. They're actually designed for data collection exercises. If you have that mindset, you will make a much better decision. Number two, measure first impression at the end of the interview, not at the beginning. And that's hard to do. I grant you that's hard to do, but if you can suspend judgment, just ask questions, find out what they've done, find out where they've excelled. At the end of the interview, you will have a much better impression of the candidate that's more accurate. And it will be based on information rather than just what you see when they walk into the room. Too much of what we do in early hiring is a beauty pageant. We walk in, we talk to somebody, if they're friendly, they're articulate, they're outgoing, and they have a decent resume, we hire them. And a good portion of them are not the top performers that we want, and it's not a right fit. So first impressions have a huge impact. Lou Adler's first book on performance-based hiring, the subtitle, I loved it, A Rational Way to Make a Gut Decision. I'm not saying ignore first impression. I'm just saying ignore it for the first 30 minutes of the interview and then take your temperature on a candidate. It will make you much, much better at interviewing and hiring. So that's my last thought for this call.
Okay. I see we don't have a lot of time, but we do have time for maybe a couple of the questions that came in. So one of the things that one of our listeners is asking about is, and it's for both of you, is even though we're focused today more on eliminating bias, diversity, early careers, do you think there has to be, does this really work? How do you convince your stakeholders that these processes really work? And how do you get the buy-in of not only folks in the talent acquisition and recruiting space, but how do you really get it, from the hiring managers who might have that old playbook? Well, this is the job description. This is what's always worked. How do you really do that? Because I think folks want to come back from this webinar, learn more, but they want to be able to actually apply it to the work that they're doing.
I'd love to hear what Bryan's got to say. You go first.
Okay. So I will just say I train literally thousands of hiring managers, just got back from Hong Kong, and I would say 90% of them already know something's wrong. They don't think the process they have is working, and they don't think they get through an interview and actually know whether the candidate's good or not. So when I go out and train in performance-based hiring, managers are eager to have something that's concrete, that's actionable, that they can see, why am I asking this question? How does it relate back, and what does that information have to do with performance? So we've done it with hundreds and hundreds of companies and have plenty of examples of where it has worked. But our experience is if you expose a manager to it and you give them a clear path, structured interview process based on performance, they take to it very well, and they get great results out of it with just a few changes to what they're doing. So I don't think it's a hard sell. They're anxious to have something that actually works. Kristen?
I think that's right. I would just add that I think, first of all, I hope you like my change of venue. I just had to move from a place to another. So I'm now in the sunshine. I would say that three things. One is go ahead and engage your team who makes decisions about hiring around that exercise that I mentioned, which is have the conversation to understand if you're aligned, and get alignment around what you believe drives performance. The second is, I think, begin to collect data. So actually, once you've said, okay, so we think these are the 5 things that matter, just make it really simple, score them in whichever way you think is appropriate. Just begin to collect that data. And then you can start, the third thing is then just to do some analysis of that data. Look for patterns. So you said, oh, we thought, we all sort of agreed on how to score people on these things. And then we started to do that, and it looks like we didn't end up hiring people that were really high on these things. That's interesting. You'll just start seeing all sorts of interesting patterns as you look through kind of like your hire, no hire, win-loss report with your people, if you will. So I think that's a simple way to get started. And then as you have exposure to those things, then you might have more of an appetite to get some support around, predictive analytics. And there are lots of interesting things going on in terms of technologies and vendors there. Koru is just one of them. And then, of course, I've got to give another plug to my colleague about the structured interview. Just training people to do that, giving them access to information. And once they know how, they start believing it and doing it.
Okay, so we have 1 minute. Yeah, we have 1 minute left, but I did want to give you each 20 seconds because one of our listeners said, is there one lightning round tip, if there was one word you'd like to give us before we sign off from each of you?
So I'll go. Know the job. I think the data that Kristen put out there, even the same job in a different company is not the same. And so know what success looks like, know what performance is, and use that as the filter for everything you do in your hiring process. That is the basis of a performance-based process. So that would be my suggestion.
Kristen?
I would say my suggestion is stop the insanity. If you know you're doing things that aren't actually driving performance, then just don't do them anymore.
That's great. Well, I want to thank both Kristen and Bryan for giving us so much information and data. I've learned a lot myself, a lot to think about. And thanks so much for the audience for signing in and listening, and for your questions. And please be on the lookout. There's going to be some special offers from both the Adler group and Koru. You'll get them in follow-up emails. And again, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Trudy. Thank you, Bryan. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. You'll be receiving an email in your inbox shortly, and so be sure you'll be looking for that. And we hope to see you on future webinars with Koru and the Adler Group. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.